Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišak, and I work as the Deputy Head of Foreign Desk in Slovak Daily Pravda, which, by the way, means truth, and it's not Russian Pravda. I don't think Larry Damon needs much of an introduction, but here we go. He is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and the Mosbacher Senior Fellow in Global Democracy at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. For decades, his research has focused on democratic trends and conditions around the world, as well as on policies and reforms to defend and advance democracy. In February, Larry wrote an article titled, "Trump's America is in a free fall, not a slippery slope to tyranny." So I wanted to hear directly from him. How does he assess what Donald Trump and his people are doing? How can we resist the recession of democracy in the US and around the world? Are there any reasons for optimism? An easy stay in Trump's America? Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Coffee. For the link, see also a description of this episode. And now, up to the new debate. Larry, in February, you wrote an article titled, "Trump's America is in a free fall, not the slippery slope to tyranny." You also said that President Donald Trump is instilling fear not just among lawmakers, but every sector of society that dares to criticize him or hold him accountable. 3 months have passed since what you said. Do you feel the same way, that Trump's America is in a free fall to tyranny? People are disappearing from the streets and homes, are wrongfully deported. The DHS Secretary Kristi Noem cannot explain what habeas corpus is. Trump's administration is toying with the idea of disrespecting judicial verdicts, and I can go on. So how serious is this?
It's very serious for the reasons you described and others that could be delineated. But it is a more complex and contested picture than you described. And it is one that is constantly evolving and being challenged. It's true, everything you're saying, but there are also a lot of court cases that are challenging these things. Just as we speak today, the federal courts have issued a temporary restraining order preventing the Trump administration from implementing the outrageous order they issued against Harvard University, taking away all the international student visas of Harvard students. The courts have issued a very large number of other temporary restraining orders, injunctions, suspensions of what Trump has been doing. We do not yet have, this is extremely important to emphasize, an instance where the Trump administration has defied a final, clear decision by the federal judicial system, either because the Supreme Court has made a ruling that is final and substantive, not merely procedural, or because they've declined to rule and a lower federal court ruling stands. The Trump administration is dancing around the edges of this and hinting at insubordination, but we're not there yet. And I think there are some grounds to believe that they won't want to openly defy Supreme Court or federal court ruling that's final and say, we don't respect the courts any longer and they don't matter. So that's one thing. The courts have constrained them. We're also starting to see more pushback in the Congress. Now, the House did pass by a single vote this very reckless bill on taxing and spending that has been pushed through the House of Representatives, but they had trouble getting it through. And I think that it's going to be heavily challenged and changed in the Senate. And we're starting to see, I think, some members of the Congress express more reservations and signals that Trump is not going to have an absolute blank check for anything he wants to do. Whether in the end they'll yield to withering pressure or not, as they have so far, the Republican members of the House and Senate, we don't know. But I do think that when you look at the judiciary, when you look at the civil society, we're starting to see a lot more resistance than we were before. And it is certainly, in my view, not the case that Trump has a simple, open, and uncontested pathway toward authoritarianism.
This is very interesting what you just said, and I want to come back to this, how to resist it. But you mentioned in your article fear, instilling fear. So how important is it to Trump's political vision, if he has any, to instill fear into his critics? And how successful is he so far in this effort? At least some technological firms, law firms, even media and universities are clearly trying to please Trump. On the other hand, do not obey in advance is probably the most important advice from Timothy Snyder when he explains how to face authoritarianism.
Right. I agree with your last statement and almost everything else you said. I think that fear remains very important in multiple respects. At the individual level, there's political fear and there's physical fear, and I will explain both of those. And then at the institutional level, there's fear of punishment and victimization, and the hope that gestures of compliance, partial compliance, low profile, and retreat from resistance will buy them protection. It's almost like a mafia operation, where you're buying protection. So at the level of individuals, particularly members of Congress, and from his party, the fear is that they will be what's called primaried, that if they stand against Trump, he or Elon Musk will run a candidate against them in a Republican primary and they'll lose. So a number of members of Congress have retired because they didn't want to face this. A famous one is Rob Portman in Ohio, and that's how J.D. Vance got elected. Rob Portman was a conservative but institutionalist who was increasingly troubled by Trump 1.0, and in 2022, he just decided not to run for re-election. He probably would have lost to J.D. Vance in a Republican primary because he wasn't pure MAGA enough. And now there's a Republican senator in Texas, John Cornyn, who almost became Senate Majority Leader, who will be in a very tough renomination battle against the Texas Attorney General, who's pure MAGA, Ken Paxton. And right now, Cornyn is losing in the polls. So there's a real fear among Republican members of the House and Senate that if they don't toe the line, they'll be defeated in a Republican primary. And that has to do with the antiquated and, I think, very poorly suited to the times nature of our electoral system. If we had proportional representation in the U.S., as you have in most of Europe, MAGA would have been a separate party, probably a lot like Alternative for Germany, frankly. And they would have gotten a smaller share of the vote. The traditionalist Republican Party would have broken away and had their own party, and they wouldn't be facing this danger of extinction. If we had the electoral reform that we're seeking in the United States in single-member districts of ranked choice voting with open primaries, and then you advance the top 4 or 5 candidates to the general election and use preferential voting, we could also save a lot of more principled Republicans. And indeed, that's how Lisa Murkowski got elected in Alaska, reelected a few years ago. So there are institutional antidotes to this. On the physical fear side, many of these people are getting death threats. It's really troubling. And in addition to the threats against themselves, some of them are getting messages in your district saying, we know where your goddaughter goes to school, sort of thing. And so there are a lot of extremists out there, and this is not your typical European country. A lot of these people are heavily armed, and the members of Congress know they don't know who's, these death threats. Obviously, people don't put their name and address down when they send a death threat, but it's no secret that there are a lot of guns out there. And you just saw what happened. This was coming from the left rather than the right, but you just saw what happened in Washington, D.C. the other night when some fanatic who was unhappy actually did kill two people who worked at the Israeli embassy. So that's at the individual level. And then at the institutional level, there is a lot that's happening behind the scenes for universities and other actors, law firms, trade unions, so on, to coordinate. But that's only been partially successful so far.
So, talking about instilling fear, it seems Trump applies this also to the international scene. In February, he ambushed Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky when he repeated the Russian lies in the Oval Office. The South African President Cyril Ramaphosa was another of Trump's targets when he was confronted with the far-right tropes related to the white South African farmers. Why is Trump doing this? Is this also related to the domestic politics?
No, I don't think so. I don't see what he gains domestically from doing this. He kind of feeds his MAGA base, but they're with him anyway. No, this is who he is. This is what he believes. He's a bully. He's a thug. He's an authoritarian personality. He wants people to bow down to him in the United States, and he wants people to bow down to him internationally. So it's got very little, in my view, to do with domestic politics. The tariffs are they have a domestic political angle. He thinks I think mistakenly, that this is what people want. What he's going to find is that as it's doing more and more damage to the American economy, to rising prices and so on, that it's hurting him politically. But he's so isolationist and he's so twisted in his understanding of economics that he is persisting with something like the tariffs and the destruction of our alliances, even when it's clear that it's damaging him politically. It's really interesting. When he gets signals that there is severe damage happening, either in the polls or in terms of the reaction of domestic and international markets, the stock market, the bond market, the interest rate on 30-year U.S. Treasury bills, there's some signs that he pulls back, as he did on some of the tariffs. But now he's starting up again with a 50% tariff on the European Union and so on. Look, there is a presumption among a lot of actors that this is a fully rational individual, calculating cost, benefit, this and that. I think that needs to be somewhat modified. This is a psychologically extremely damaged and unhealthy individual, someone who shows and has shown for many years before his arrival in the White House the first time, many of the symptoms of a kind of extreme sociopathic narcissism, which is why the people who form better diplomatic relations with him have learned that you have to descend and debase yourself to a level of severe obsequiousness. So this is where we're at. It's a very dangerous situation. And I think that a lot of the answer is you've got to push back. Bullies retreat in the face of resistance.
Academia is clearly in Trump's crosshairs. You mentioned the case of the Harvard University. And in fact, some academics are even leaving the US. Are you staying?
Oh, I have no intention of leaving ever. Most people are not leaving. Look, Tim Snyder, Marcy Shore, and Jason Stanley have all left for the University of Toronto. And Tim Snyder and Marcy Shore, a married couple, indicated they'd made that decision before Trump was elected, and it was not in response to Trump's election. Although the picture is now kind of affirms their decision, I'm sure, in their minds. Others may leave. I'm sure you may see some individuals leave, and there may be some, some other forms of movement, at least of a temporary nature. But I think most people, they love the United States. They love living in the United States, and they don't want to surrender the United States of America to this thuggish, authoritarian, degrading operation.
Larry, so you are staying. Let me ask you a different question. Do you think that I, as the journalist who is openly criticizing Trump, do you think that when I decide to visit America as a journalist, I should be worried?
I don't think you need to be worried about being imprisoned once you come to the U.S. I think the worry you should have is that you won't get a visa to come here. It's very clear now that they're weaponizing the visa process. And I think they're making clear that anything they have, what they think is pure discretion over, they intend to weaponize. Federal funding, NSF funding, although that shouldn't be purely discretionary, visas, a lot of stuff like that. So I'm telling people I know who come here for conferences and so on, I say to them, I say to you, I'm not telling you what to do, but just bear in mind, they're scraping the web, they're vindictive, and they're fully capable of denying visas to people purely on the basis of what they write. So to some of these people, my response is, you have to decide how important it is for you to be writing and saying the things you're saying. If you're a journalist, I think it's very important that you do and say that, what you want to say, and that you not be intimidated. And if it means they won't give you a visa, well, I'll be in Prague for Forum 2000 in October. We can meet there.
I'm more than happy to. In fact, I have a valid visa for the US, journalistic visa. So I'm definitely considering to visit your country. They might send me back. That's a possibility. But yeah, I'm definitely coming sooner or later. But, talking about this and about Trump, and you said that he's a thug, he's a bully. Can I use the F word, meaning fascist, neo-fascist or proto-fascist, when describing Trump, or at least some people around him?
I would counsel caution in the use of that word, not out of fear of retaliation, but out of the quest for analytic integrity and precision. I think that the best way to use the F word when it's applicable is that there are fascistic, so the adjective in a more precise sense, there are fascist-like elements to the agenda, the behavior, the elevation of one leader above all, the demand for absolute loyalty, the extreme nationalistic exaltation of the fatherland or motherland, the promotion of fear of the other, and the racist element, which has been most recently validated by, of all the peoples in the world that are suffering identity victimization or physical threat, he chooses to bring in the Afrikaner whites. I mean, what does that tell you about how he thinks? Who are very far from being the ones most at risk and most victimized. So I shy away from the use of this word, not out of fear of any kind, but because I think it's very important for us in the analytic community of reporting, analysis, scholarship, and so on, to be very analytical and precise and not just engage in name calling. We don't have concentration camps. We don't have political prisoners with maybe one or two aspiring cases in their minds. We have the beginning of the weaponization of the judicial process. I expect the FBI, the IRS, it's clear where they're headed. But this is not yet Hungary. It's not yet Turkey. No one has really used the F word in applying the analytic judgment to Orban or Erdogan, and they're much further along than in the path of descent than we are. So I think there are some fascistic elements to the MAGA philosophy, and there are fascistic elements to Trump's persona. But what we're really looking at here is just authoritarianism. He wants to be an autocrat. He wants to silence opposition. He wants complete deference to his will and his persona. And honestly, that's bad enough. That's plenty bad enough.
It definitely is. And I will quote you again. This conference is taking place at a time of a deepening global recession for freedom and democracy in the world. When do you think you said this?
Well, the democratic recession has been going on. I think it started around 2006 or 2007, and it really began to become visible as early as 2010. So it could have been any time in the last 15 years. When was it?
In fact, it was in November 2017 at the conference, When Does Populism Become a Threat to Democracy at Stanford University.
Okay.
So it means we are in this at least for 8 years. You said even 15 maybe. So now I want to ask you how to resist it, especially in the US.
Well, I think we've learned a lot about resistance. So the first thing is you are much more likely to succeed if you act early, right? There's a difference between an assault on an illiberal democracy and an assault on a liberal democracy. An illiberal democracy, a lower quality democracy, like there's less immunity. The courts are weaker. The rule of law is weaker. The democratic norms are weaker. So the path of descent in a place like Turkey is easier because the liberal institutions of monitoring and restraint were weaker in the first place. But when you have a liberal democracy like the United States, and of course it was true of Hungary and Poland as well, then you have potentially more resources at your disposal, and you've got to use all of them and as quickly as possible. So the courts are absolutely vital, and this is why autocrats try and strip the judiciary of its political independence as soon as possible. Orban was able to do that relatively quickly because he was able to amend the Constitution because he had a special majority. Law and justice, it took them more time and they never fully succeeded because they weren't able to amend the Constitution. So they had to wait for judges to finish their terms. And now Donald Tusk has the opposite problem of having to wait for the law and justice supported judges to finish their terms. But the courts are critical, and the courts are proving critical now. So sue at every step and resist judicially by attempting to block and reverse in the courts the illegal and unconstitutional actions. That's number one. Number two, I think principled people within the state, in the civil service, the military, the police, the FBI, they need to refuse to cooperate with illegal and unconstitutional actions. And to do their jobs, I hope as many of them as possible will hang on as long as they can. I understand why many of them are leaving because they just don't want to be part of this. And I respect that. But trying to preserve the civil service as a professional body loyal to, their professional mission and the Constitution and the laws, I think that's very important. The third thing is kind of sectoral resistance in civil society. And this is one reason why I think the universities are so important. The law firms, which we didn't see coming, that kind of punishment of law firms, but they are, of course, pillars of the rule of law. And people need to hang together. You know, the famous phrase attributed to Benjamin Franklin after they made the Constitution, we must hang together or we will all surely hang separately. And autocrats try and divide the individual and institutional organizational actors and then pick them off one by one and play them off against one another. And they need to be denied that opportunity. And cross-sectoral coalitions are very important here. I think the business community is crucial. And business in the United States needs to realize if they don't have a rule of law and they don't have democracy in the United States, it's not going to be a place that, and what they have is just personalistic, oligarchic, kleptocratic corruption. You know, this is not going to be a great environment for investing in or a great environment for the predictability that makes for attractive investment and economic and commercial success. So the business community is absolutely crucial. Then you have the dimension of civic resistance, nonviolent civil resistance, which is well known to you in Central and Eastern Europe and has been critical in turning back authoritarian projects. And I think may now, really be posing a challenge to the Serbian autocracy all over again for the second time. And I think we're seeing more protests in the streets, more other forms of defiance. I think the consumer boycott of Tesla is extremely important. Tesla's sales in Europe, as you know, are plummeting, and they're down significantly in the U.S. as well. And maybe that had some role in Elon Musk announcing this week that he was going to pull back significantly on his funding for political campaigns. And the final straw we have to play here is the electoral one. And we just need to mobilize massively, as the polls did in October of 2023, to defeat this project at the ballot box.
Larry, so to wrap it up just briefly, how much does Trump embolden autocrats and wannabe autocrats around the world, especially if you look at the Central and Eastern Europe? There is Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, you mentioned him a couple of times, who openly rejects liberal democracy. And for example, Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico says something similar. By the way, Fico claims he's a leftist, but he visited CPAC and he met Elon Musk. So how much autocrats and wannabe autocrats can look at Trump and say, okay, this is how I want to be?
I think there's a significant element of that, but you need to divide it into two groups. There are the autocrats who are already in power, and I think they are feeling validated, liberated, unleashed, unmonitored, and unrestrained, which is why it's so important for the European Union to step up and really enforce the acquis communautaire and make clear to these kinds of European autocrats that if they violate the European Charter, they're not going to get European subsidies. Europe is not going to subsidize democratic backsliding. But, Modi, Fico, Orban, they're all emboldened by Trump. And you saw, or maybe you didn't see, that Donald Trump Jr. went to meet with the Serbian president and kind of give him a moral slap on the back in exchange for, another big hotel investment. Then there are the people who want to be autocrats and are looking at what Trump has done after what some of these others have done and thinking, I can do that too. So it's a permissive environment. And the most important 2 points I would make are, number one, I think there's a good chance that this will be temporary. We're stuck with this guy for another 3 years and 8 months, but I don't think this is the indefinite future of the United States. So we need the world to kind of hang on for us in the interim. And therefore, number two, I just cannot stress enough how important the European Union is in this interim period. The United States, for the next 3 years and 8 months, is not going to lead the global democratic project. Somebody needs to step in and play that role to a greater extent. And the obvious candidate is the European Union.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe, listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on the other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. For the link, see also the description of this episode. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.